A wealthy businessman invites a maid to pose as his friend's wife at a party. He thought it would be just a joke, but it turned into an unexpected romance. Edward Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Oil, casting elongated shadows on the polished marble floor. Edward was sitting in his Italian leather chair, his eyes fixed on the cityscape of skyscrapers that stretched to the horizon. His fingers drummed restlessly on the mahogany table, a nervous tick that betrayed the agitation beneath his impassive facade. "Mr. Blackwood," his assistant's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Mr. Harrison is on line 3. He wants to confirm your presence at the wedding party this weekend." Edward sighed, massaging his temples. "Tell him I'll be there," he replied, his voice laden with ill-concealed boredom. One more party, one more social event, where he would have to smile and feign interest in superficial conversations about shares, mergers, and acquisitions. When the door closed, Edward stood up and walked over to the window. Below, the city pulsed, thousands of lives intertwining in a frenetic dance. He wondered how many of these people were as bored as he was, trapped in a life that seemed perfect on the outside, but empty on the inside. A few kilometers away, in a modest district of the city, Mia Rodriguez was finishing her shift at the cleaning company where she worked. Her muscles ached after hours of scrubbing floors and cleaning windows, but there was a glint of determination in her brown eyes. "See you tomorrow, Mia," called out her colleague Rosa as she headed for the exit. Mia waved back, a tired smile on her lips. "See you tomorrow, Rosa. Take care." Alone in the changing room, Mia changed out of her uniform and into faded jeans and a simple t-shirt. As she sorted through her belongings, her fingers brushed against a crumpled brochure at the bottom of her bag. She pulled it out, smoothing out the folds. It was a flyer for art classes at the local community college. For a moment, Mia allowed herself to dream. She imagined herself in an art gallery, her own creations hanging on the walls, people admiring her work. But then reality set in, reminding her of the bills to pay, the rent arrears, the responsibilities that weighed on her shoulders. With a sigh, she put the brochure back in her bag. "One day," she muttered to herself, "one day I'll get out of this rut." The walk home was long, but Mia took the opportunity to observe the city around her. She passed expensive store windows, elegant restaurants, places that seemed to belong to a completely different world from her own. Sometimes she found herself imagining what it would be like to be part of that universe, even for a day. Arriving home, a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, Mia was greeted by the insistent meowing of her cat Picasso. "Hi, my love," she said, bending down to stroke the feline. "Mommy's home." While preparing a simple dinner, pasta with tomato sauce, Mia turned on the small television in the kitchen. The local news was showing images of a charity party, the smiling faces of celebrities and local businessmen. For a second, she caught a glimpse of a man in a dark suit, with piercing blue eyes and a serious expression. Something about him caught her eye, but before she could understand what it was, the image changed. The phone rang, snapping her out of her reverie. It was her mother, calling from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. "Mija, how are you?" Elena's tired but affectionate voice sounded on the other end of the line. "I'm fine, Mom. How are you? Aren't you working too hard?" Elena laughed softly. "Oh, you know how it is. There's always someone who needs looking after. But tell me, how was your day?" Mia hesitated. She wanted to tell her mother about her dreams, about her burning desire to do something more with her life. But the words got stuck in her throat. It was normal. Nothing special. After hanging up, Mia sat at the kitchen table, playing with the food on her plate. The silence of the apartment seemed to amplify the emptiness she felt inside. She looked at her hands, calloused by hard work, and wondered if they would ever create something beautiful, something that would make her heart sing. The next morning, Edward woke up in his luxurious penthouse, the sound of the alarm clock echoing through the spacious bedroom. Automatically, he got up, following his meticulously planned morning routine. Showering, shaving, choosing an impeccable suit, every move was precise, calculated. As he ate his breakfast, a green smoothie prepared by his personal chef, Edward flicked through the day's newspaper. News of distant wars, market fluctuations, political scandals. It all seemed so distant, so irrelevant to his carefully constructed life. His driver was waiting for him in the garage, as usual. On the way to the office, Edward barely noticed the city passing by the car window. His mind was already on the work, the meetings, the business that awaited him. That's when his phone rang. Harrison's name flashed up on the screen. "Edward, old boy." Harrison's jovial voice sounded on the other end. "Ready for the party of the century this weekend?" Edward forced a smile, even though he knew Harrison couldn't see him. "Of course, I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Great. Oh, and don't forget to bring your wife. Sarah is looking forward to seeing you again." Edward's smile froze. Wife. Of course. The wife that didn't exist, the lie he'd told months ago to avoid Harrison's attempts to set him up on dates. "About that, Harrison. Don't even think about making excuses, Edward. Everyone's curious to meet the woman who's finally won over the most sought-after bachelor in town. See you on Saturday." Before Edward could protest, Harrison hung up. The CEO leaned back in the leather seat, a sense of panic growing in his chest. How was he going to get out of this? Meanwhile, Mia was starting another day at work. Today, her team was assigned to clean one of the corporate buildings in the city center. As she pushed her cleaning trolley through the gleaming corridors, she couldn't help but notice the executives in their expensive suits, the secretaries with their high heels clicking on the marble floor. That's when she saw him. The man from the news the night before. He walked past her without so much as a glance in her direction, engrossed in a conversation on the phone. Mia found herself watching him, intrigued by his imposing presence, and at the same time, by the air of loneliness that seemed to envelop him. Little did she know that their lives were about to intertwine in a way that neither of them could have foreseen. As the day progressed, Edward found himself increasingly distracted. The lie about his non-existent wife weighed heavily on his mind. He needed a solution, and fast. That's when, looking out of his office window, his eyes landed on the cleaning crew working in the building opposite. An idea began to form in his mind. It was risky, maybe even crazy, but it could work. With renewed determination, Edward picked up the phone. It was time to make some unusual arrangements. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when Edward's limousine pulled up in front of the building where Mia worked. He adjusted his tie for the umpteenth time, a nervous gesture that betrayed his normally composed appearance. "Are you sure about this, sir?" asked his driver, casting a worried glance in the rearview mirror. Edward nodded, more to himself than to the driver. "Sometimes, James, madness is the only sane option." He got out of the car, his heart racing. His hands were sweating slightly as he approached the staff entrance. That's when he saw her. Mia was coming out of the building, her dark hair tied up in a messy bun, her work uniform changed for jeans and a simple t-shirt. There was a natural gracefulness to her movements, a beauty that transcended the simple clothes she wore. "Miss Rodriguez," Edward called out, his voice softer than he had intended. Mia turned around in surprise. Her eyes widened as she recognized the man in front of her, the same one she had seen in the corridors of the corporate building. "Yes?" Edward hesitated for a moment, the words he had rehearsed seeming inadequate now. "I have an unusual proposition for you." Over the next few minutes, Edward explained his situation. The lie about a non-existent wife, the impending party, the need for a chaperone. He offered Mia a considerable sum of money to pose as his wife for one night. Mia stared at him, stunned. Her mind was spinning, torn between disbelief and a spark of excitement. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. The other part longed for the chance to glimpse, even for one night, the world she had always observed from afar. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Edward looked into her eyes, surprised by the depth he found there. "Because you have something authentic, something not easily found in my world." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she should refuse, that this was crazy. But Edward's words echoed in her mind, mingling with her own repressed dreams. I accept," she heard herself say, hardly believing her own words. The relief on Edward's face was palpable. He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes in a way Mia hadn't expected. "Good. We've got a lot to do and not much time. Let's go." The next few hours passed in a blur for Mia. She was taken to exclusive boutiques, where stylists dressed her in more expensive clothes than she had ever dreamed of wearing. Hairdressers and makeup artists worked on her appearance, transforming her into a glamorous version of herself. Throughout the process, Edward watched her with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. He found himself noticing details about her, the way her eyes lit up at certain colors, the slight accent that colored her voice when she was excited, the natural grace with which she moved, even in high heels she clearly wasn't used to. Finally, the night of the party arrived. The limousine pulled up in front of Harrison's mansion, where bright lights and soft music announced the lavish event taking place inside. Edward got out first, adjusting his tuxedo. He held out his hand to Mia, feeling a slight tremor in her fingers as she entwined them with his. Mia emerged from the limousine like a vision. The long navy blue silk dress hugged her curves, the modest but elegant neckline revealing just enough to intrigue. Her hair was arranged in soft waves that framed her face, the makeup enhancing her natural beauty without masking it. For a moment, Edward was speechless. Mia, sensing his gaze, felt her cheeks flush. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice betraying a slight nervousness. Edward swallowed, finding his voice. "You look stunning." Mia smiled, a smile that lit up her whole face. "Thank you. You don't look bad yourself." They exchanged a glance, a current of understanding passing between them. For a brief moment they both forgot the farce, lost in the reality of the moment. The moment was broken by the approach of Harrison, who came to greet them at the entrance. "Edward, old boy, and this must be the famous Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison exclaimed, his eyes scanning Mia up and down with evident approval. Edward felt an unexpected pang of jealousy. He put a protective arm around Mia's waist, surprising himself with the gesture. "Harrison, this is Mia," Edward introduced, his voice carrying a note of pride that wasn't entirely feigned. Mia held out her hand, remembering the etiquette instructions Edward had given her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Harrison." "Edward speaks very highly of you." Harrison smiled, delighted. "The pleasure is all mine, my dear. Come in, come in. Everyone is eager to meet the woman who has finally captured the heart of our most coveted bachelor." As they followed Harrison inside, Mia felt her nervousness grow. The ballroom was a sea of designer dresses, sparkling jewelry, and sophisticated conversation. She unconsciously squeezed Edward's hand, seeking support. Edward leaned in, whispering in her ear, "Relax. You were born for this." His words, although meant to reassure her, sent a shiver down her spine. Mia took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the hall as if she belonged there. As the evening progressed, Mia surprised everyone, including herself, with her grace and natural charm. She navigated conversations with an ease that Edward hadn't expected, her eclectic knowledge and unique perspectives captivating the guests. Edward watched her with growing admiration. He watched her discuss contemporary art with a museum curator, debate environmental policies with a senator, and exchange recipes with an ambassador's wife. With each interaction, Mia shone brighter, her confidence growing visibly. In a moment of pause, Edward pulled her to a quieter corner of the room. "You're doing incredibly well," he said, a genuine smile on his lips. Mia laughed, a crystalline sound that made something inside Edward stir. "Who knew that years of watching people while cleaning their offices would give me so much ammunition for small talk?" Edward felt a pang of guilt as he was reminded of Mia's true situation. But before he could say anything, they were interrupted by a group of Edward's close friends. "So this is the mysterious Mrs. Blackwood," exclaimed a woman, her critical eyes scanning Mia. "Where are you from, dear? I don't remember seeing you in social circles before." Mia felt panic rising, but kept her composure. "Actually, I grew up in a small town in the countryside. Edward and I met during one of his business trips." Edward, sensing the tension, quickly intervened. "Mia brings a refreshing perspective to our usual discussions, don't you, dear?" Mia cast a grateful glance at Edward before turning to the group. "Edward exaggerates, but I must admit that I find it fascinating to observe how different realities intertwine in our society. The group seemed intrigued by her response. Soon, Mia found herself at the center of a lively discussion about social inequality and corporate responsibility, topics on which she had strong and well-founded opinions. Edward watched in amazement as Mia not only participated in the conversation, but steered it, gently challenging entrenched assumptions and offering perspectives that clearly many there had never considered. As the evening progressed, Edward found himself more and more enchanted by Mia. It wasn't just her outward beauty, although she certainly looked stunning, but the way her intelligence, compassion, and authenticity shone through every interaction. For the first time in years, Edward felt truly alive, truly present, and as he looked at Mia, laughing at something someone had said, he realized with a jolt that he was in danger of falling for her, and falling hard. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. This was supposed to be a farce, a one-night stand. But looking at Mia now, Edward knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again after tonight. And as the party continued around him, Edward found himself facing a dilemma he had never expected to face: how to deal with real feelings born out of a fake situation. The party was still in full swing, soft music filling the air as the guests circulated around the elegant hall. Edward and Mia had managed to find a moment of relative quiet near one of the large windows overlooking the illuminated garden. "You're doing incredibly well," Edward murmured, leaning slightly towards Mia. "No one would suspect that this isn't your usual scene." Mia smiled, a glint of amusement in her eyes. Who knew that years of watching people in their offices while I cleaned would be such good preparation for a high society party? Edward felt a twinge of guilt as he was reminded of Mia's true situation. He opened his mouth to say something, but was interrupted by the arrival of a group of people. "Edward, how nice to see you out of that office of yours." A middle-aged woman, dressed in an elaborate sequined dress, approached, her eyes quickly fixed on Mia. "And this must be your wife. What a lovely surprise." Mia felt her heart racing but kept her composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, extending her hand with a grace that surprised even herself. "Margaret Holbrook," the woman introduced herself, her handshake firm. "I must say, dear, you're not at all what I expected for Edward's wife." The comment, although said with a smile, carried a hint of something. Curiosity, suspicion. Edward, sensing the tension, put a protective arm around Mia's waist. "Mia is full of surprises," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride that wasn't entirely feigned. "Oh, of that I have no doubt," Margaret replied, her eyes scanning Mia from top to bottom. "Where are you from, dear? I don't remember seeing you in our circles before." Mia felt panic rising, but took a deep breath, remembering the story she and Edward had agreed on. "Actually, I grew up in a small town in the countryside. Edward and I met during one of his business trips." "Fascinating," Margaret commented, although her tone suggested she thought anything but. "And what did you do before you married our dear Edward?" Mia hesitated for a moment, feeling everyone's gaze on her. It was then that she saw, over Margaret's shoulder, a familiar face. It was Rosa, her colleague from the cleaning company, pouring champagne on a tray. The shock of seeing a piece of her real life in this fantasy world almost made Mia lose her balance. Edward, sensing her sudden tension, gently squeezed her waist in a gesture of support. I used to work in community services," Mia finally replied, finding her voice. "I firmly believe that we all have a responsibility to give back to society, no matter our position." Her response seemed to take Margaret by surprise. "Well, that's noble," she said, clearly not knowing how to react. Edward, seeing an opportunity to change the course of the conversation, intervened. "Actually, it was Mia's commitment to the community that first attracted me. She made me see the world from a completely new perspective." Her words, although part farce, carried a sincerity that surprised them both. Mia looked at Edward, seeing something in his eyes that made her heart leap. "How lovely," Margaret commented, although her tone suggested that she thought anything but. "Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of the party. Edward, don't forget the council meeting next week." As soon as the group had moved away, Mia let out a shaky sigh. "That was intense," she muttered. Edward nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. You were incredible. But I saw that something shook you for a moment. Is everything all right? Mia hesitated, debating whether to mention Rosa. Deciding that honesty was the best policy, she leaned closer to Edward. I saw a co-worker from the cleaning company. She's pouring champagne. Edward's face contorted into an expression of concern. That complicates things. Do you want to leave? Mia considered for a moment, but then shook her head. No, I'm having fun after all. Besides, it would be suspicious if we left so early, wouldn't it? Edward smiled, admiring her resilience. You're right. What do you say we take a walk around the gardens? We can get some fresh air. Mia nodded, grateful for the suggestion. As they walked outside, she couldn't help but notice the stares they attracted. Some of admiration, some of curiosity, and some didn't seem friendly at all. The cool evening air was a welcome relief from the heat of the crowded hall. The gardens were a sight to behold, with illuminated fountains and artistic sculptures scattered along the winding path. It's beautiful out here, Mia commented, her voice laden with genuine admiration. Edward watched her, noticing how the soft light of the lanterns danced across her face. It is, he replied, although his eyes were fixed on her, not on the gardens. They walked in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Mia who finally broke the silence. Edward, can I ask you a question? He nodded, curious. Of course. Why did you do it? Why did you choose me for this farce? Edward stopped walking, turning to face her. His eyes sought hers, and for a moment all masks fell away. Honestly, I don't know. When I saw you leaving work that day, something about you struck me. You had an authenticity that I haven't seen in a long time in my world. Mia felt her heart race at the intensity in his gaze. And now? What do you see? Edward stepped forward, reducing the distance between them. Now I see someone incredible, someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew about my life. The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Mia felt herself leaning towards Edward as if drawn by an invisible force. It was then that they heard voices approaching. Quickly they moved apart, the magic of the moment broken. Mr. Blackwood, a man in a dark suit, approached, accompanied by a group of people Mia recognized as some of the party's most prominent guests. We were just talking about your latest project, the expansion into the Asian market, isn't it? Edward quickly assumed his CEO posture, although Mia could see a shadow of reluctance in his eyes. Ah, yes, it's a bold move, but we believe the growth potential justifies the risk. As Edward was drawn into a discussion about market strategies and financial projections, Mia found herself momentarily adrift. It was then that she noticed a small structure further along in the garden, softly lit. Curious, she approached it, discovering that it was a small open-air art gallery. The walls were covered with paintings and photographs, all apparently by local artists. Mia found herself absorbed in the works, her heart racing as she recognized the style of some of the artists she secretly admired. She was so focused that she didn't notice anyone approaching. Impressive collection, isn't it? Mia turned in surprise to find an older man with grey hair and kind eyes. It's wonderful, she replied sincerely, especially the way they capture the essence of the city. The man smiled, clearly pleased with her observation. You have a good eye. I'm Thomas, the curator of this little exhibition. Mia immediately felt at ease with Thomas. Over the next few minutes, they engaged in a lively discussion about artistic techniques, contemporary movements, and the role of art in society. It was in the middle of this conversation that Edward found them. He stopped at the entrance to the gallery, watching Mia gesture animatedly as she talked about the importance of accessibility in art. At that moment, seeing her so passionate and articulate, Edward felt something change inside him. It wasn't just attraction or admiration, it was something deeper, more frightening. He was falling in love with Mia, truly and irrevocably. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, leaving him momentarily stunned. How was that possible? They barely knew each other. This was supposed to be a farce, a one-night stand. But looking at Mia now, her face lit up with passion for something that clearly meant a lot to her, Edward knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. When Mia finally noticed him, her face lit up with a smile that made Edward's heart leap. "Edward, come and meet Thomas. He's the curator of this incredible exhibition." Edward approached, greeting Thomas with a firm handshake, but his eyes kept returning to Mia, amazed at the transformation he saw in her. As the evening progressed, Edward found himself more and more enchanted by Mia. It wasn't just her outer beauty, although she certainly looked stunning, but the way her intelligence, compassion, and authenticity shone through every interaction. As they walked back to the main party, Edward made a decision. He couldn't let this night end like this. He couldn't let Mia just go back to her normal life, as if none of this had happened. "Mia," he said softly, stopping her before they entered the hall. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but would you like to go out with me? For a real date, I mean. No pretenses, no shams. Just the two of us." Mia stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, Edward feared he had made a terrible mistake, but then slowly a smile spread across her face. "I'd love to," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And there, under the stars and with the distant sound of the party in the background, Edward and Mia shared a moment of genuine connection. A moment that promised the start of something new, unexpected, and potentially wonderful. But as they walked back to the party, neither of them noticed the curious glances and whispers that followed them. Nor did they notice Rosa, Mia's work colleague, watching them with an expression of shock and confusion. The night was far from over, and the challenges that awaited them had only just begun. The party was still in full swing, but for Edward and Mia, the world seemed to have shrunk to just the two of them. Returning from the garden, they exchanged furtive glances, shy smiles laden with unspoken promises. However, the bubble of happiness in which they found themselves was about to burst. "Edward, there you are!" Margaret Holbrook's shrill voice cut through the air. She approached, dragging a stern-looking man with her. "I want you to meet someone. This is Charles Winthrop from Winthrop Industries. Charles, this is Edward Blackwood and his wife." The hesitation in Margaret's voice at the mention of Mia did not go unnoticed. Edward felt Mia stiffen beside him and instinctively placed a protective hand on her back. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Winthrop," Edward greeted, extending his hand. "This is Mia." Charles shook Edward's hand with excessive force, his cold eyes appraising Mia. "Interesting," he murmured. "I don't remember hearing about a wedding, Blackwood. You've kept it pretty quiet, haven't you?" The insinuating tone made Edward's stomach churn. "We prefer to keep our personal lives private," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Understandable," Charles continued, his gaze fixed on Mia. "And you, my dear, what family do you come from?" Mia felt panic rising, but years of facing difficult clients in her cleaning job had prepared her to keep her composure. "Actually, Mr. Winthrop, I come from a rather modest family. I believe that a person's value lies not in their surname, but in their actions and character." A tense silence fell over the group. Margaret seemed to have choked on her champagne, while Charles' eyes narrowed dangerously. Edward, sensing the tension escalating, decided to intervene. "Mia has a refreshing perspective on many things. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with her." The words came out with a sincerity that surprised even Edward. Mia looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Charles, however, didn't seem impressed. "Fascinating," he said, his tone indicating that he thought anything but. "Well, I hope this refreshing perspective doesn't interfere with business, Blackwood. The merger between our companies is too delicate to be compromised by distractions." The veiled insult made Edward's blood boil. He was about to reply when Mia placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Winthrop," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe that a diversity of perspectives is essential to the success of any enterprise. The best ideas often come from unexpected places. Don't you agree?" Charles blinked, clearly taken aback by Mia's eloquence. Before he could reply, however, a new face joined the group. Mia. Mia Rodriguez. Is that you? Mia's heart froze. She turned slowly to find Rosa, her colleague from the cleaning company, now dressed in a waitress's uniform and carrying a tray of canapes. "Rosa," Mia managed to say, her voice almost a whisper. Rosa's eyes went from Mia to Edward to the other members of the group, clearly confused by the situation. I didn't know you'd be here as a guest. I thought you were off today." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward could feel Margaret and Charles's gazes on him, their minds working to connect the dots. It was Mia who finally broke the silence. With a courage that Edward couldn't help but admire, she straightened up and faced the group. "Rosa is my colleague and friend," she said, her voice firm. "We work together at the cleaning company. Yes, I'm a cleaner, and yes, I'm here as Edward's guest." The revelation dropped like a bombshell. Margaret gasped audibly, while Charles's face contorted into an expression of ill-concealed disgust. Edward, realizing that the moment of truth had arrived, decided to embrace the situation. He took Mia's hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "Mia is, in fact, a cleaner," he said, his voice laden with pride. "And she's the most incredible woman I've ever met. Her origin in no way diminishes her value or intelligence." Rosa watched the scene with wide eyes, clearly not knowing how to react. Margaret seemed to be having trouble breathing, while Charles looked furious. "Is this some kind of joke, Blackwood?" he snarled. "You bring in a cleaner to pose as your wife. What kind of game are you playing?" Edward felt anger rising inside him. "It's not a game, Winthrop, and I suggest you measure your words carefully." The tension in the air was palpable. Other guests were beginning to notice the commotion, approaching curiously. It was at this point that Harrison, the host, appeared. "What's going on here?" he asked, his worried gaze flicking from one face to another. Charles turned to Harrison, his face red with anger. "Your friend Blackwood tricked us all. He brought in a cleaning lady to pose as his wife. It's an insult." Harrison looked at Edward, confusion and disappointment evident on his face. "Edward, is it true?" Edward took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the stares on him. He looked at Mia, seeing in her eyes a mixture of fear and trust. She trusted him to do the right thing. "It's true that Mia works as a cleaner," Edward began, his voice firm. "But it's a lie that she's impersonating someone she's not. Mia is exactly who she appears to be, an intelligent, compassionate, and strong woman. The fact that she cleans offices for a living does nothing to diminish those qualities." He turned to face Charles directly. "And if that's a problem for you or anyone else here, maybe it's time we re-evaluated not just this merger, but the whole way we conduct our business and our lives." A stunned silence fell over the group. Mia looked at Edward with a mixture of shock and admiration. Rosa, still holding her tray of canapes, looked as if she was about to faint. Harrison was the first to recover. "Edward, Mia, I think we need to talk in private. Please accompany me to the office." As they followed Harrison out of the ballroom, Edward could hear the whispers and murmurs spreading through the party. He knew that he had just jeopardized his reputation, his business, perhaps even his career. But as he felt Mia's hand in his, firm and confident, he realized that he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt alive, authentic. And that, he realized, was worth more than any business deal or social status. In Harrison's office, away from prying and judgmental eyes, Edward and Mia prepared to face the consequences of their newly revealed truth. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The night that had begun as a farce had turned into something much more real and profound than either of them could have imagined. And while the world outside revolved in shock and confusion, inside that office, two people discovered that sometimes the most important truth is the one we find in ourselves and in each other. Harrison's office was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, the walls lined with books and the air heavy with the scent of expensive cigars. Edward and Mia were sitting side by side on a leather sofa, their hands still intertwined, while Harrison watched them from his imposing mahogany desk. The silence that hung over them was palpable, charged with tension and expectation. It was Harrison who finally broke it, his voice a mixture of disappointment and curiosity. "Edward, I've known you for years. I never imagined you capable of something like this. What the hell were you thinking?" Edward took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Mia's gaze on him. "Honestly, Harrison, I wasn't thinking. At least, not at first." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "It all started as a stupid lie. I was tired of everyone's attempts to push me into relationships, so I made up a wife. But then when the party got closer, and I needed to make the lie real." "You decided to hire a cleaning lady to play the part," Harrison added, his voice laden with incredulity. "It wasn't like that," Mia interjected, her voice soft but firm. "Edward approached me, yes, but I had a choice. I could have said no." Harrison turned his attention to Mia, his eyes softening slightly. "And why didn't you?" Mia hesitated, her eyes meeting Edward's for a moment before returning to Harrison. Because I wanted to see what it was like. Even for one night, I wanted to know what it was like to be part of this world." The raw honesty in Mia's voice seemed to touch something in Harrison. His countenance softened even more. "And what did you think?" he asked, genuinely curious. A small smile touched Mia's lips. "It's stunning and frightening at the same time. There's so much beauty, so much opulence, but also so much superficiality. And I realized that deep down we all want the same things: connection, understanding, a place to belong." Edward watched Mia with admiration, amazed once again at her wit and eloquence. Harrison nodded slowly, seeming to ponder Mia's words. Then he turned to Edward. "What about you? What did you intend to gain from all this?" Edward felt the weight of the question. He looked at Mia, then back at Harrison. "In the beginning, peace. I just wanted people to stop trying to push me into relationships. But then," he paused, searching for the right words, "then I met Mia, for real, and I realized how empty my life was, how disconnected I was from the real world, from real people. Mia showed me a perspective that I had forgotten existed." Harrison watched them for a long moment, his gaze moving from one to the other. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Do you realize what a mess you've created? Charles Winthrop is furious. Half the guests are shocked, the other half are gossiping madly. This could have serious repercussions for business, Edward." Edward nodded, the reality of the situation weighing heavily on him. "I know, Harrison, and I take full responsibility for it. Mia must not suffer any consequences for my stupidity." Mia squeezed Edward's hand, her voice firm as she spoke. "No, Edward, I'm as responsible as you are. I was a willing participant in all of this." Harrison watched them with a mixture of exasperation and something that seemed almost admiration. "You two are impossible, you know that, but—" He paused, a slight smile forming on his lips. "There's something refreshing about seeing such honesty and loyalty." He stood up, walking over to the window overlooking the bright garden. "The outside world is going to be tough on you. The press will have a field day when this story leaks, and you can be sure that it will. The company's shares will probably fall. There will be consequences, Edward." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of his actions, but then he felt Mia squeeze his hand again, and something inside him grew stronger. "I know, Harrison, and I'm prepared to face those consequences, but I also know that for the first time in a long time, I'm being true to myself and to others. That has to be worth something." Harrison turned to face them, his expression softening. "Maybe it is, Edward, maybe it is." He walked back to his desk, sitting down heavily. "Look, I can't promise that everything will be all right, but I can promise that I'll do what I can to soften the blow. You two seem to have something special, something real, and God knows we need more reality in this artificial world of ours." Mia and Edward exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and apprehension on their faces. "What do we do now?" Mia asked, her voice low. Harrison sighed. "Now you're going to get out of here. Go home, get some rest. Tomorrow, Edward, I want you in the office first thing. We'll need a strategy for dealing with the press and the shareholders." He then turned to Mia. "As for you, Ms. Rodriguez, I suggest you get ready. Your life is probably going to change a lot over the next few days." Mia nodded, the reality of her situation beginning to weigh on her. Edward put a protective arm around her. "She won't be alone," he said, his voice firm. Harrison watched them for a moment before nodding. Good. Now go. I'll deal with the guests here. As they stood up to leave, Harrison called out to them one last time. Edward, Mia, good luck, you'll need it. Leaving the office, Edward and Mia found themselves back in the corridor that led to the main hall. The music and voices from the party seemed distant now, as if they belonged to another world. Are you all right? Edward asked softly, watching Mia's face. She took a deep breath before answering. I'm not sure what I am. Scared, for sure, but also relieved. It's strange not having to pretend anymore. Edward nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. I know exactly how you feel. They stopped for a moment, staring at the doors that led back to the party. On the other side was a world that now seemed strange and hostile. Can we just leave? Mia asked, her voice almost a whisper. I don't think I can face them all right now. Edward felt a wave of protection run through his body. Of course, he replied, guiding her towards a side exit. Let's get out of here. As they walked through the garden towards the entrance to the estate, the cool night air seemed to clear their minds. The reality of what had happened, of what they were about to face, began to settle in. Edward, Mia said, stopping suddenly. What happens now? What happens to us? Edward turned to face her, taking her hands in his. Under the soft light of the garden lanterns, he could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear mixed with something else. Hope, perhaps. Now, he said, his voice soft but determined, now we face whatever comes. Together, if you want. Mia stared at him, searching his eyes for the certainty that he really meant it. What she saw there made her heart race. Together, she repeated, a small smile forming on her lips. Edward felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He leaned in, his lips meeting Mia's in a soft kiss, full of promise. When they parted, they were both smiling, despite the uncertainty that awaited them. Let's go home, Edward said, entwining his fingers with Mia's. As they walked towards the car, leaving behind the glitter and buzz of the party, Edward and Mia knew they were entering uncharted territory. The world they knew had changed irrevocably that night, but as they got into the car, their hands still linked, there was a feeling that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The farce was over, but something real and precious had been born in its place. And as the chauffeur drove them through the night, leaving behind a world of luxury and pretension, Edward and Mia allowed themselves for the first time to glimpse a future together. A future that, although uncertain, seemed full of possibilities. Morning came with a burst of blinding light and the shrill sound of phones ringing incessantly. Edward woke up startled, momentarily disoriented. Beside him, Mia stirred, her eyes slowly opening to the new reality that awaited them. It started, Edward muttered, reaching for his cell phone on the bedside table. The screen was flooded with notifications, missed calls and urgent messages. Mia sat up, pulling the sheet over herself. How bad is it? Edward slid his finger across the screen, his eyes widening with each new headline he read. Oil CEO in scandal with cleaner. High society farce. The truth behind Edward Blackwood's marriage. Modern Cinderella. Cleaner wins over billionaire at gala party. Mia let out a groan, hiding her face in her hands. Oh God, it's worse than I imagined. Edward put down the phone, turning to hug her. Hey, look at me, he said softly, lifting her chin with one finger. We're going to face this together, remember? No matter what they say. Mia nodded, trying to find strength in Edward's eyes. But what about your company? Your reputation? Before Edward could answer, his phone rang again. It was Harrison. Edward, you need to come into the office now. Harrison's voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. The press is going crazy, the shareholders are panicking, and the board is demanding an emergency meeting. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation. I'll be there in an hour, he replied before hanging up. Turning to Mia, he saw the fear in her eyes. I'm going to have to go, he said softly. But I don't want to leave you alone in the middle of all this. Mia forced a smile, trying to look stronger than she felt. "I'll be fine. I have to face it at some point, don't I?" Edward hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her. It was then that he had an idea. "Come with me," he proposed, "not to the meeting, but to the office. We can face the press together, show a united front." Mia pondered for a moment before nodding. "Okay, together." An hour later, Edward's car pulled up in front of the imposing Blackwood Oil building. A crowd of reporters and photographers crowded around the entrance, cameras and microphones in hand. "Are you ready?" Edward asked, squeezing Mia's hand. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "As ready as I can be." The moment they stepped out of the car, they were engulfed in a sea of flashbulbs and shouted questions. "Mr. Blackwood, is it true that your wife is a cleaner?" "Ms. Rodriguez, how does it feel to be called a scammer on social media?" "Edward, the shareholders are demanding your resignation. Any comments?" Edward wrapped an arm around Mia protectively, guiding her through the crowd. "No comment at the moment," he repeated firmly as they moved towards the entrance. Inside the building, the chaos continued. Employees stopped to stare at them, some with curiosity, others with obvious disapproval. The walk to the elevator seemed endless. In Edward's office, his assistant Sarah was waiting for them with an expression of barely concealed panic. "Mr. Blackwood, the board is meeting in the conference room. They're not happy." Edward nodded, grateful for Sarah's loyalty in the midst of the storm. "Thank you, Sarah. Can you arrange something for Mia to eat and drink? And perhaps find somewhere quieter for her to wait?" Sarah smiled gently at Mia. "Of course, sir. Come with me, Ms. Rodriguez." Before Mia could follow Sarah, Edward pulled her into a tight hug. "It's going to be okay," he whispered in her ear. "I love you." The words came out naturally, surprising them both. Mia pulled away slightly, looking into Edward's eyes with a mixture of surprise and emotion. "I love you too," she replied softly, sealing the statement with a quick kiss. With one last look of encouragement, Edward headed for the conference room, preparing for the battle that awaited him. The meeting was as brutal as he had expected. Accusations of irresponsibility, demands for explanations, veiled threats of dismissal. Edward faced everything with a calm that surprised even himself. "Gentlemen," he finally said, when the storm of accusations had subsided, "I understand the gravity of the situation. I understand that my actions may have damaged the company's image, but I also believe that we have an opportunity here." The silence that followed was laden with skepticism. "An opportunity?" one of the board members asked incredulously. Edward nodded, feeling more secure as he spoke. "Yes, an opportunity to show that we are more than just numbers on a balance sheet, that we value people, regardless of their origin or social position, that we believe in second chances and true love." He paused, looking each board member in the eye. "Think about it. A love story that transcends social barriers. A CEO who finds happiness not in elitist circles, but with someone who represents the ordinary worker. Isn't that the narrative that could bring us closer to the public, show a more human side to our company?" The silence that followed was different. There was still skepticism, but also consideration. It was Harrison who spoke first. "It's risky, Edward, but it can work. If we manage the narrative correctly, we could turn this into an inspiring story." Slowly, other board members began to nod. The atmosphere in the room changed from hostility to hopeful caution. "It won't be easy," one of the directors warned. "The press will be relentless. You'll both be under intense scrutiny." Edward nodded, aware of the challenges that awaited them. "We're prepared for that. Mia is stronger than you think. We both are." After a few more hours of intense discussion and strategic planning, the meeting was adjourned. Edward left the room feeling exhausted, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He found Mia in her private office, staring out of the window at the city below. When she turned to face him, Edward saw the concern in her eyes. "How was it?" she asked anxiously. Edward smiled, pulling her into a hug. "Better than I expected. It's not going to be easy, but they're willing to give us a chance." Mia let out a sigh of relief, burying her face in Edward's chest. "I'm so proud of you," she murmured. Edward gently pulled her away, looking into her eyes. Mia, there's something we need to discuss. How we deal with this publicly is going to take a lot from both of us. Are you sure you want to go through with it? With us? Mia stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Finally, she smiled, a smile full of determination and love. Edward, I've cleaned toilets and offices for years. Do you really think a few paparazzi and nasty headlines are going to scare me off? I'm in it with you, all the way. Edward felt his heart expand with love and gratitude. He pulled her into a passionate kiss, all the stress and worry of the day dissolving in the warmth of their embrace. When they parted, they were both panting but smiling. So, what's the next step? Mia asked, her eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Edward smiled, taking her hand. The next step is for us to face this together. We're going to give an interview, tell our story our way, show the world that what we have is real. Mia nodded, squeezing Edward's hand. I'm ready. As they prepared to face the media storm that awaited them, Edward and Mia knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be obstacles, criticism, moments of doubt, but looking at each other, they found the strength they needed. Together, they were ready to rewrite not only their own stories, but also challenge the expectations of a society that had long needed a dose of reality and true love. The journey had only just begun, but with their hands intertwined and their hearts united, Edward and Mia were ready to face whatever challenges fate had in store for them. 6 months have passed since the night that changed everything. The late afternoon sun bathed Edward's office in golden hues, casting long shadows over the city below. Edward stood by the window, watching the incessant movement of the streets, lost in thought. A soft knock on the door brought him back to the present. Come in, he called, turning to see Mia entering, a warm smile lighting up her face. Ready to go? She asked, moving in for a quick kiss. Edward nodded, reaching for his jacket. More than ready. These last few months have been intense. Mia laughed softly, entwining her fingers with his. I think intense is an understatement, isn't it? The last few months had been a roller coaster of emotions and challenges. The interview they gave right after the initial scandal was a turning point. Sitting side by side in a television studio, Edward and Mia told their story with honesty and vulnerability. They talked about their unusual meeting, the initial lie that turned into something real and profound, and how love took them by surprise. The audience's reaction was mixed at first. There were critics who accused them of manipulation, of creating an elaborate farce to gain sympathy. But there were also those who identified with the story, who saw in it a modern fairy tale, proof that love could transcend social barriers. Blackwood Oil faced initial turbulence. Shares fell, some investors withdrew, contracts were questioned. But under Edward's leadership, and with Harrison's tireless support, the company began to implement significant changes. Social responsibility programs were expanded, inclusive hiring policies were implemented, and a new emphasis was placed on valuing all employees, regardless of their position. Slowly, the narrative began to change. Blackwood Oil was transforming from just another cold, impersonal corporation into an example of a company with a social conscience. Mia, for her part, faced her own challenges. Media scrutiny was relentless at first. Every aspect of her life was scrutinized, every choice questioned. There were times when she wanted to give up, to return to the anonymity of her former life. But with Edward's support, she found her voice. Instead of hiding, Mia decided to use her new platform to make a difference. She became a staunch defender of workers' rights, especially those in professions that are often invisible or undervalued. Her experiences as a cleaner lent credibility to her words, and she soon became a respected voice in discussions about inequality and social justice. "What are you thinking about?" Mia asked softly, noticing Edward's distant gaze. He smiled, squeezing her hand. "About how our lives have changed, how I have changed. You know, before I met you, I thought I had everything, but in reality, I had nothing that really mattered." Mia pulled him close, her eyes shining with emotion. "We've both changed, Edward, and we keep changing, growing together." They left the office hand in hand, waving to Sarah as they passed. Edward's assistant, who had become a close friend and ally in recent months, smiled back. In the elevator, Edward turned to Mia. "Nervous about today's event?" Mia took a deep breath. "A little. I'm still not used to all this attention, but I know it's important." The event in question was the inauguration of the Blackwood Rodriguez Foundation, a joint initiative between Edward and Mia, focused on education and employment opportunities for underprivileged communities. It was the culmination of months of hard work and planning, a tangible way of giving back and making a difference. As they left the building, they were greeted by a few camera flashes. The paparazzi were still following them, but the intensity had diminished considerably. Edward and Mia had learned to navigate this new reality with grace, offering polite smiles but maintaining their privacy. In the car on the way to the event, Mia turned to Edward. "Remember the first time we got into this car together? For that party?" Edward laughed, the memory vivid in his mind. "How could I forget? I was so nervous, so sure that everything would go wrong." "And in a way it did," Mia added with a smile. "But it also worked out so well." Edward took her hand, bringing it to his lips for a gentle kiss. It couldn't have been more right. The venue was packed when they arrived. Familiar faces greeted them. Harrison, who had become one of the biggest supporters of their relationship. Rosa, Mia's former colleague who now worked at the foundation. Even some of Edward's staunchest former critics, who had gradually been won over by the couple's sincerity and dedication. When Edward took to the stage to make his speech, the room fell silent. Mia watched from the front row, her heart bursting with pride. "A year ago," Edward began, his voice firm, "I was lost. I thought success was measured in dollars and cents, in contracts signed and shares valued. I was so wrong." He paused, his eyes meeting Mia's. "It took a lie to show me the truth. It took falling in love with someone I should only be pretending to love, to understand what really matters in life." The audience was captivated, many eyes watering at the emotion in her words. This foundation is not about charity, it's about opportunity. It's about recognizing the inherent value in every person, regardless of where they come from or what they do for a living. It's about rewriting the rules of a society that for too long has valued the wrong things. When she finished her speech, the room erupted in applause. Mia came on stage, tears in her eyes, to join Edward. Together they cut the ribbon, officially inaugurating the Blackwood Rodriguez Foundation. Hours later, when the event came to an end and the last guests had left, Edward and Mia found themselves alone in the now empty hall. "We did it," Mia whispered, resting her head on Edward's shoulder. Edward hugged her tightly, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, we did it. But this is only the beginning." Mia raised her face to look at him. "What do you mean?" Edward smiled, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "I've been thinking, what if we expanded, not just the foundation, but our lives? Mia Rodriguez, would you marry me? For real this time?" Mia gasped, her eyes widening in surprise before filling with tears of joy. "Yes," she replied, her voice tinged with emotion. 1,000 times yes." As they kissed, the world around them seemed to disappear. At that moment, they weren't the CEO and the ex-faxer. They weren't public figures or targets of gossip. They were just Edward and Mia, two hearts that had found each other against all the odds. When they finally parted, both laughing and crying at the same time, Edward leaned his forehead against Mia's. "You know," he said softly, "I think I finally understand what a happy ending means." Mia smiled, her eyes shining with love. "It's not an ending, Edward. It's just the beginning of a new chapter." And there, in the silence of the empty hall, with the city sparkling outside and a future full of promise ahead, Edward and Mia sealed their promise with another kiss. Their story, which had begun with a lie, had become the purest truth. And while the world continued to spin outside, they knew that together they could face any challenge that came their way. Because in the end, love, true, deep, and transformative love, was the only thing that really mattered, and they had that to spare. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to leave a like. Use the super thanks located just below the video to directly support the channel and help create more amazing content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Now don't miss the next incredible story that's appearing on your screen. I greatly appreciate your support and hope to see you soon. Thank you for watching.